I'm so grateful to be with you here digitally. My name is Steve Sieck, and I serve as the co-director of choral studies at the Lawrence University Conservatory of Music, and as the director of music at the Fox Valley Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. Today, we're talking about what it means to sing other people's songs. We're going to be looking at three things. One, why this feels like a very normal and uncontroversial thing to do. Two, why this can actually be a very complicated thing to do. And three, what we might do differently going forward. So let's start with number one, why singing other people's songs is normal and good. If we go back to the mid-20th century, we have a movement in music education called the Music Appreciation Movement. We learned about Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, and we celebrated the Western European and North American white canon. In response to that, we had the multicultural music movement that came about in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And that was to challenge this idea of a European-centric education. It's a big world filled with wonder. There are more kinds of music than just Beethoven. There are more kinds of food than just peanut butter and jelly. Right? In fact, we celebrated that all cultures sing. That all cultures sing. And that learning one another's songs is one of the best ways to make bridges across cultures. And after all, music is just notes and rhythms, so let's learn each other's notes and rhythms. How else can we build a better community? We certainly can't ignore and not perform less represented songs, right? And I would suggest that it was in this spirit that our hymnals included songs from the world's religions. Where's the challenge in that? Let's look at number two. Right? How this might be a more complicated thing than we talk about. I want to suggest that there's a myth pervasive in this thinking about a level playing field. The myth of the level playing field. If every culture throughout the globe and throughout history had been given an equitable chance and treated the same way, then yes, we can take from all of these different musical traditions and sing one another's songs, and there would be no controversy in that. But if we acknowledge that history didn't go that way, that there are oppressors and oppressed, well, the field gets uneven. As a brief example, half of my family is from Ireland, right? And we know that for about 900 years, the Irish were subjugated, raped, murdered, and systemically held down, politically, culturally, and religiously. The field between the British and the Irish is profoundly tilted. What would it mean to my family if a British choir was singing Irish folk music? And maybe not in a let's get to understand the Irish neighbors of ours and their way of life, but in a this song is pretty kind of way. Have they thought about what that would feel like for the Irish? We're going to come back to that. At heart is this idea of othering and unmarked. Othering is a term that comes from the cultural anthropologist Edward Said. And the idea is actually very simple, and we have to see it the same way that we are breathing air. Othering suggests that there's an unmarked category, a normative category. We don't need a label for it. And then there's the other category. That's the thing that's outside. It's foreign. It's exotic. Here's an example. There's a really wonderful husband-wife team that are composers. Tim Takash is identified as a composer. And his wife, Jocelyn Hagen, is often identified as a female composer. We are othering her by saying, you're like a composer, just the female version. When you're in the grocery store, there's aisle after aisle after aisle of food that is marked by its taxonomy. It's dried goods, or it's a different kind of canned tomato. There's a whole aisle for that. And then there's an aisle that we call ethnic foods. And what we mean by that usually is not white. Right? That ethnic foods aisle may include Southeast Asian food, it might include Latinx food, it might include African American food, but it doesn't include white food usually, right? And so by calling it an ethnic foods aisle, we are othering it. Now, of course, all food is ethnic. There's no food from Mars, right? But we mean something very specific by that. There is a hair care aisle. I haven't been to one in a while, but I'm told that there is a hair care aisle. And then at the end of that, there's an ethnic hair care section. Well, all hair is ethnic. What we mean by ethnic hair is black. We mean it's very curly and has a specific kind of treatment need, right? And all of this serves to remind people you're not the unmarked category, okay? Unmarked categories are changing, are dynamic. They have histories. They have political disagreements between Republicans and libertarians and conservatives and Democrats and progressives, right? But the marked category is always assumed to be static, to be a monolithic, to be a museum exhibit, right? And this gets really problematic when you start thinking about it, that, for example, when we say, well, how would you describe the history of European music? You'd be like, well, where do we even begin? But if you say, what is Bulgarian music? You're like, oh, that's when you have like 6 women singing together in tight harmony, right? It gets locked into that. There are Bulgarian rappers. There's Bulgarian opera. But the fact that we can only imagine 6 women singing in tight harmony with a very specific kind of Bulgarian dress suggests that we have othered them into a static museum exhibit. I'm going to show you a photo that's very hard to look at, but this is from the World's Fair in St. Louis, where they literally created a museum of the world's people, right? Now, if you're walking about this in St. Louis in the early 20th century, it probably meant that you were white, and maybe you were disagreeing with your wife about politics, or maybe, right, the person ahead of you and the person behind you liked different baseball teams. But the idea that everyone from this country dresses like this, lives in this kind of house, that's not only othering, but like boxing into a museum exhibit. So in this photo, the Igorot people from the Philippines dress like this, build a house like this, right? Whereas, what does it mean to be from St. Louis would have had 15 different answers. This kind of language is not just about food and healthcare. This kind of language invades music. Suddenly music gets political. I went to a very, very big and popular music distribution website last year, and I put in the search term, exotic flavor. Here are some examples. This arranger brought these songs home from a trip to South Africa. Genuine ethnic flavor abounds in these 2 folk songs. I don't know what the ethnic flavor of a South African folk song is, but I know that they mean it's not white. Here's another one. Ethnic flavor comes alive in this spinning song, depicting an ancient activity that still lives today in this part of the world. Now, they're talking about a Kashmiri song, right? And the idea that this ancient activity is still alive in the museum exhibit that we call Kashmiri ethnic people, right? It's pervasive. There's the ethnic flavor of Hanukkah. There's the ethnic flavor of Mexican folk songs. There's the ethnic flavor of Jamaican folk melodies, particularly if you add percussion instruments, right? And so I often make a joke, a very pointed joke with music teachers when I'm talking about this, saying that if there's an added drum part, you need to ask yourself how and why. Here's a good rule of thumb. People aren't a consumable product like cilantro. People are dynamic and changing and disagree with one another. So what it means to sing other people's songs is a loaded question. Who are the we? Right? What is our role in this power dynamic as singers? Who are the other? Do you see the bait in the way I phrased the question? And what is the other's role in this song? Why did we choose this song? What are our motivations? Do we want something spicy in our service? Are we trying to learn something about this culture's music? What do we already know about this song or this culture? Does this song challenge, confirm, or expand our knowledge of this culture? Is it idiomatic? I have a friend who's a scholar in African American choral music who has a whole research project on non-idiomatic choral music of African Americans, right? Because idiomatic would suggest spirituals, gospel, and jazz, which are the 3 things that white consumers have demanded out of African American music production. But it turns out there are African American composers that are writing cantatas. You just don't know about it because it doesn't fit the aisle that we've built for it. These questions matter. As a choral director, I have sung and conducted countless African American slave spirituals as the concert closer. Now, that term, concert closer, refers to the kind of finishing song that generates a powerful ending and a standing ovation at the end. You don't have to think about this very long before you see the problem of harvesting the musical fruit of slavery for white concert entertainment. Actually, Frederick Douglass spoke out about this in the mid-1800s. It's not a new challenge. But singing the songs of slaves without thinking about why your white mouth is singing it is part of a white supremacy culture. I like how these notes and rhythms sound, and I like the way they sing it. And I, as an unmarked category, get to consume whatever I want without thinking about its ownership or production. it turns out that music is often very political. Most of us learned the song Camptown Races by Stephen Foster, and it's not just a catchy tune. Foster actually wrote it for a blackface minstrelsy troupe, right? When white people would burn cork and paint themselves up to be silly caricatures of African Americans. This is in the 1840s, and blackface minstrelsy was part of a national agenda to normalize slavery and to normalize this inferiority of African Americans, right? Songs reinforce or challenge the status quo, and the status quo usually benefits some of us and hurts a lot of us. So when a predominantly white congregation sings, "We Shall Overcome," which is in our hymnal, what would it feel like to be the only African American member in that space? Are we singing in allyship, in solidarity with them? Are we singing to appropriate their just cause without doing our own anti-racist work? Are we singing because we like the tune and we haven't thought about what it sounds like coming out of our own white mouths? There are not easy answers here. And this brings us to number 3. Where do we go from here? I want to start by pointing out an obvious thing about expertise that needs to be repeated as often as possible. You know how your family shares the same DNA, the same culture, the same where we grew up, the same socioeconomic experience, the same religion. It's a bubble. And yet, now as you're adults, you struggle to make it through Thanksgiving without a blow-up, right? That suggests that you are dynamic and changing, that your population, your family, is dynamic, changing, multivariable. There are 44 million African American citizens, and that too is a population that is dynamic and changing and multivariable. There is not a black vote. You might have an African American friend who says to you, "Oh, I want you to sing more spirituals. It's the treasure trove of my people's music." You might have an African American friend who says, "You're racist for asking me about it." There is no council that approves what you can and cannot sing. There is no council that approves what you can and cannot sing. There is only your conscience, your reasons, and your search for deeper understanding. Because people don't like sitting with the bad feelings of historical inequalities, we want to fast forward. Can't we just say now that we're a beloved community? Can't we just sing together in harmony like that Coca-Cola commercial? I want to suggest that we're skipping steps. If I burned your house down, I didn't acknowledge it, I didn't apologize for it, I didn't repay you, and then I said, "So you want to grab dinner tonight?" You would be concerned that I had skipped some steps. So what it means to sing other people's songs, for me, depends on the work we're each doing to get there. Can we let go of defensive postures, popularly known as white fragility? Can we listen? Can we acknowledge the truths in history? Can we seek reconciliation? Songs don't exist in a bubble apart from the people who sing them. This isn't a sermon about songs. This is a sermon about Unitarian Universalist principles. The inherent worth of all, justice and equity in our human relations, a responsible search for truth and meaning, and a celebration of the interdependent web of existence, of which we are all a part. May it be so. Amen.